The sun rose blood-red over the parched Syrian desert on June 28, 1098, illuminating one of history's most improbable military victories. What transpired that day near the ancient city of Antioch would become legend, a tale of how a desperate, outnumbered Crusader army faced impossible odds and emerged victorious against a force 8 times their size. The Battle of Antioch stands as a testament to how terrain, timing, and the unpredictable forces of nature can overturn every conventional calculation of military power. The stage is set. Antioch under siege. To understand this remarkable battle, we must first comprehend the dire circumstances that preceded it. The First Crusade had been underway for nearly 2 years, and the Crusaders had fought their way across thousands of miles of hostile territory. By October 1097, they had reached Antioch, one of the great cities of the ancient world and a strategic prize of immense value. Whoever controlled Antioch controlled the land routes between Anatolia and the Levant. The city's defenses were formidable. Massive stone walls stretched for miles around the city, punctuated by hundreds of towers. The fortifications had been built and rebuilt over centuries, incorporating Roman engineering genius with Byzantine improvements and recent Seljuk modifications. To the north, mountains rose steeply, making approach from that direction nearly impossible. To the west, the Orontes River provided a natural barrier. The city was, by any measure, one of the most defensible positions in the Near East. The Crusader army that arrived to besiege Antioch numbered perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 fighters at its peak, though these numbers would fluctuate dramatically over the coming months. The leadership was fractious, divided among several nobles of roughly equal status. Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Robert of Flanders each commanded their own contingents and pursued their own ambitions. This lack of unified command would prove both a weakness and, paradoxically, a source of resilience. The siege began in October 1097 and would drag on through a bitter winter. The Crusaders quickly discovered that besieging Antioch was easier said than done. They lacked sufficient numbers to completely surround the city, which meant supplies continued to flow in through gates the Crusaders couldn't blockade. Meanwhile, the besiegers themselves struggled to find food and fodder in the surrounding countryside, which had been stripped bare by previous armies. As winter descended, conditions in the Crusader camp deteriorated catastrophically. Starvation became commonplace. Horses died by the hundreds, then thousands, depriving knights of their most valuable military assets. Disease swept through the camps in waves. Desertion became epidemic, with knights and common soldiers alike slipping away in the night, making the long, perilous journey back toward Constantinople or even Europe. Some contemporary sources suggest that by spring 1098, the Crusader army had been reduced to perhaps 20,000 effective fighters, less than half its original strength. Yet the Crusaders persisted, driven by a complex mixture of religious fervor, ambition, desperation, and the simple fact that retreat would be nearly as dangerous as staying. They maintained their siege lines, fought off sorties from the city, and waited for either a miracle or a breakthrough. The betrayal and the trap. The breakthrough came through treachery. Bohemond of Taranto, the most militarily capable of the Crusader leaders, had been secretly negotiating with a Turkish guard named Firuz, who controlled several towers on the southern wall of the city. The exact motivations for Firuz's betrayal remain debated by historians. Some sources suggest he was motivated by personal grievances or financial incentives, while others hint at religious or political factors. Whatever his reasons, Firuz agreed to allow the Crusaders into the city through the towers under his command. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, the plan was executed. A select group of Crusaders climbed rope ladders into the towers controlled by Firuz. Once inside, they opened a nearby gate, and the Crusader army poured into Antioch. The fighting was savage and chaotic. The Turkish garrison, caught by surprise, attempted to mount a defense, but was overwhelmed in street-by-street combat. By dawn, most of the city was in Crusader hands, though the citadel perched on a mountaintop above the city remained under Turkish control. The Crusaders' elation at capturing Antioch lasted approximately 3 days. On June 5th, scouts brought devastating news. A massive relief army was approaching under the command of Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul. Kerboga was one of the most powerful Muslim military leaders in the region, and he had assembled a coalition force that dwarfed anything the Crusaders could muster. Contemporary sources vary wildly in their estimates of this army's size, with Crusader chronicles often citing numbers exceeding 100,000. Modern historians generally consider these figures exaggerated, but even conservative estimates place Kerboga's force at 70,000 to 80,000 warriors. The Crusaders, who now occupied Antioch but were desperately weakened by months of siege warfare, suddenly found themselves trapped inside the very city they had just captured. The Turkish garrison in the citadel still held out above them, and now Kerboga's massive army was arriving to besiege them from outside. The besiegers had become the besieged. Kerboga's army surrounded Antioch and cut off all supply routes. The food situation, already dire, became catastrophic. The Crusaders had found little in the way of provisions when they captured the city, and what supplies existed were quickly exhausted. Within days, soldiers were eating the leather from their boots and saddles. Horses and donkeys that had survived the winter siege were slaughtered and devoured. Soon, even the city's dogs and rats became precious commodities. Starvation stalked the Crusader ranks once again, but this time there was no possibility of foraging in the surrounding countryside. Morale collapsed. Hundreds more deserted, attempting to escape down ropes from the walls at night. Some of these deserters were captured by Kerboga's forces and paraded before the walls, their heads mounted on spikes as a warning to others. The most shocking desertion came when Stephen of Blois, one of the senior nobles of the crusade, slipped away and made his way back toward Constantinople. He would later encounter the Byzantine Emperor Alexios III, who had been marching south with a relief force. Stephen's report that the Crusader cause was lost convinced Alexios to turn back, eliminating any hope of external rescue. Inside Antioch, the Crusader leadership faced an impossible choice. They could remain in the city and slowly starve, or they could attempt a breakout against an army that outnumbered them 8-1. Many argued for staying put, hoping that Kerboga's coalition might fracture, or that disease might thin his ranks. But as June wore on, and conditions worsened, it became clear that time was working against them. A decision had to be made. The vision and the decision. What happened next is steeped in both historical fact and medieval legend. A poor priest named Peter Bartholomew came forward claiming to have received visions from St. Andrew. In these visions, the saint revealed the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion, buried beneath the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch. A search was organized, and after hours of digging in the cathedral floor, Peter Bartholomew himself emerged from the excavation holding a spear point. The discovery of the Holy Lance, whether genuine relic or pious fraud, had an electric effect on Crusader morale. Medieval armies fought as much on faith and omen as on tactics and logistics. The starving, desperate warriors suddenly saw divine providence in their predicament. If God had hidden this holy relic in Antioch for them to find, then surely he intended them to triumph. The religious fervor that had carried them across half the world was rekindled in an instant. The Crusader leaders seized on this shift in morale to propose what might otherwise have seemed suicidal: a direct assault on Kerboa's vastly superior force. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would march out of the city in formation and offer battle on the plains before Antioch. There would be no clever maneuvers or attempts at surprise. They would rely on shock, discipline, and the righteousness of their cause. To modern military sensibilities, this plan appears insane. Kerboga's army not only vastly outnumbered the Crusaders, but also held significant advantages in cavalry, particularly in the swift, mobile horse archers that were the backbone of Seljuk military power. These mounted archers could pepper enemy formations with arrows while remaining out of reach, a tactic that had destroyed countless armies throughout history. The Crusaders, having eaten most of their horses during the siege, were primarily infantry. They would be slow, vulnerable, and easily surrounded on the open ground. Yet the plan had certain factors working in its favor that were not immediately obvious. First, the Crusaders had nothing to lose. Remaining in Antioch meant certain death by starvation. Even if the battle ended in massacre, at least it would be quick. This desperation would translate into ferocious fighting spirit. Second, the discovery of the Holy Lance had provided a powerful psychological advantage. The Crusaders believed they fought with God's direct blessing, which in the medieval mindset was worth more than numerical superiority. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Kerboga's coalition was not as united as it appeared. His army consisted of contingents from various Turkish and Arab leaders who often had competing interests and historical rivalries. Some had joined Kerboga reluctantly, pressured by political circumstances rather than genuine commitment to the cause. The coalition had already been camped outside Antioch for weeks, and tensions were mounting. If the Crusaders could strike hard enough and fast enough, this coalition might crack. The decision was made. On the morning of June 28, 1098, the Crusaders would march out to face their destiny. The battle begins. Dawn broke hot and clear on June 28th. Inside Antioch, the Crusader army assembled. They had been organized into 6 divisions, each under the command of a senior noble. The first division, leading the advance, was commanded by Hugh of Vermandois and Robert of Flanders. The second was under Godfrey of Bouillon, with his brothers Baldwin and Eustace. The third was led by Robert of Normandy, and the fourth by Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate whose spiritual authority had been crucial in holding the fractious Crusader leadership together. The fifth division fell under the command of Raymond of Toulouse, and bringing up the rear was Bohemond of Taranto, who would also serve as overall battlefield commander. The army that assembled in the pre-dawn darkness was a shadow of the force that had besieged Antioch 8 months earlier. Modern estimates suggest that perhaps 10,000 towns to 12,000 fighting men prepared to march out of the gates. Many were weakened by malnutrition. Most knights were fighting on foot, their war horses long since eaten. What cavalry remained was a paltry force of perhaps 200 mounted knights, nowhere near enough to turn the tide of battle under normal circumstances. Yet there was something unusual in the air that morning. The Crusaders moved with purpose and determination. They had confessed their sins, taken communion, and prayed through the night. Many wore simple white shirts over their armor, symbolizing their purity and readiness for martyrdom. They carried the holy lance at the head of their formation, borne by Peter Bartholomew himself. Whatever the reality of their military situation, they believed absolutely that God marched with them. As the gates of Antioch swung open and the first divisions began to emerge, the Seljuk army watched with what must have been a mixture of surprise and amusement. Kerboga had expected the Crusaders to remain cowering behind their walls, to be starved into submission or desperation. Now they were marching out in ordered ranks, as if they actually expected to give battle, It seemed like madness, and from a purely military standpoint, it was. The Crusader divisions filed out of the city through the Gate of St. George and the nearby Bridge Gate. The process took hours, as the entire army had to funnel through these narrow openings and then deploy into battle formation on the plain beyond. This should have been the moment of maximum vulnerability, when Kerboga's forces could have attacked and destroyed them piecemeal. Yet the Seljuk commander hesitated. Various sources offered different explanations for this hesitation. Some suggest that Kerboga was so confident of victory that he wanted to allow all the Crusaders to deploy, the better to annihilate them completely in one decisive engagement rather than forcing some to remain in the city. Others propose that he was waiting for his forces to fully assemble from their scattered camps. Still others hint that Kerboga may have been negotiating with some of the Crusader leaders, offering terms of surrender, and wanted to give them time to consider. Whatever the reason, this delay proved crucial. By late morning, the entire Crusader army had deployed into formation on the plain east of Antioch. They had arranged themselves with the Orontes River protecting their left flank and marshy ground to their right, limiting the Seljuk army's ability to envelop them. It was a sound defensive position, but they weren't planning to defend. They were planning to attack. The storm rises. The weather had been building all morning. The temperature had climbed rapidly, as it does in the Syrian summer, but there was an oppressive quality to the heat, a heaviness in the air that suggested something was coming. Dark clouds had begun to gather on the eastern horizon, and a wind had picked up, blowing from the east across the plain. Around midday, the Crusader army began its advance. They moved in tight formation, divisions close together, presenting a solid wall of spears and shields. The discipline was remarkable for a medieval army, especially one that had been reduced to such desperate straits. This reflects both the training and experience of the Crusaders. Many had been fighting together for 2 years, and the almost transcendent morale boost provided by their religious conviction. Kerboga's response was exactly what one would expect from a Seljuk commander facing a smaller, slower-moving force. He deployed his highly mobile cavalry to harass and wear down the Crusaders before committing to a full engagement. Wings of horse archers swept forward on both flanks, intending to pepper the advancing Crusaders with arrows while staying out of reach of their hand weapons. This is when nature intervened, in a manner that would change everything. The wind that had been building all morning suddenly intensified dramatically. What had been a steady breeze became a powerful gust, and then transformed into a full-scale windstorm. The clouds that had been gathering on the eastern horizon rolled forward with preternatural speed, and suddenly the entire battlefield was engulfed in a massive sandstorm. Sandstorms in this region, while not uncommon during the summer months, are typically brief affairs. But this storm was different in both its intensity and its direction. The wind howled across the plain, driving sand and dust before it with such force that visibility dropped to mere yards. The temperature seemed to drop by several degrees as the sun was blotted out, replaced by a brown-orange twilight. And critically, devastatingly for the Seljuk army, the storm was blowing from east to west, directly into the faces of Kerboga's forces and at the backs of the advancing Crusaders. Nature's cavalry. The impact of the sandstorm on the battle cannot be overstated. In an instant, every tactical advantage that the Seljuk army possessed was neutralized or reversed. The horse archers, the pride and primary weapon of Seljuk military power, became nearly useless. Firing a bow requires seeing your target, and the swirling sand made that impossible beyond a few meters. Even when shots could be attempted, the powerful wind caught the arrows and sent them wildly off course. Worse, the horses themselves panicked in the storm. These were not heavy war horses bred for stability and carrying armored knights, but lighter, faster mounts selected for maneuverability. In the howling chaos of the sandstorm, many of these horses became uncontrollable, wheeling and rearing despite their riders' efforts. The Crusaders, meanwhile, advanced steadily through the storm. They moved in tight formation, each man staying close to his neighbors, the entire line pressing forward. The wind at their backs actually helped propel them forward, and the close-packed formations that might have been a liability in normal conditions became an asset, as soldiers could maintain contact with their comrades by touch, even when they couldn't see them. The Crusader infantry was primarily equipped with spears, swords, and shields, all close-quarters weapons that didn't require long-range visibility to be effective. The sandstorm, rather than hindering them, had transformed the battlefield into exactly the kind of close-quarters melee where their heavy armor and weapons gave them the advantage. When the two armies collided, it wasn't the ranging, mobile cavalry engagement that Kerboga had planned. It was a grinding, brutal infantry fight conducted in near darkness, with visibility measured in arms' lengths. The Crusaders, desperate and fearless, pressed forward with ferocious intensity. The Seljuk forces, blinded and confused, struggled to mount any coordinated defense. Contemporary accounts from both sides describe the battle as apocalyptic. The roar of the wind mixed with the screams of men and horses. The sand itself became a weapon, scouring exposed skin and getting into eyes, mouths, and lungs. Warriors grappled with enemies they could barely see, often fighting by feel as much as by sight. The dust cloud was so thick that blood turned instantly to mud as it hit the ground. The Crusader formation, designed for a straightforward frontal assault, proved perfect for the conditions. They didn't need to see far ahead. They just needed to keep pressing forward. Their tight ranks prevented penetration and maintained momentum. Every step forward was contested, but the Seljuk defenders were fighting at every disadvantage. They couldn't mass their cavalry effectively, couldn't use their superior numbers to envelope the Crusader force, and couldn't employ their ranged weapons. The coalition cracks. As the battle wore on through the afternoon, the weaknesses in Kerboga's coalition became evident. Many of the contingents in his army had joined him reluctantly or opportunistically. They were held together by his reputation and by the expectation of easy victory over a weakened, starving enemy. Now, caught in a blinding sandstorm and facing an enemy that fought with suicidal ferocity, doubts began to spread. The first to break were contingents on the wings of the Seljuk army, those who had the least investment in Kerboga's cause and who bore the brunt of the Crusader assault. Contemporary sources suggest that some emirs believed they were facing not just human warriors, but a supernatural force, that the sandstorm itself was divine intervention. Whether they truly believed this or simply used it as an excuse for retreat is impossible to know, but the effect was the same. Once the first contingents began to pull back, others followed. In the chaos and limited visibility of the sandstorm, it was impossible for Kerboga to see what was happening on his flanks, or to send orders that would be heard and obeyed. The retreat began to spread like a contagion through his army. Units that had not even been seriously engaged began to withdraw, fearing encirclement or simply following the example of those around them. The Crusaders, sensing the shift, pressed their advantage. Bohemond, commanding the rear division, had held back a small reserve of mounted knights, perhaps fewer than 100 riders, but the only significant cavalry force the Crusaders possessed. At the crucial moment, he led these knights in a charge against what appeared to be a weakening point in the Seljuk line. The psychological impact of even this small cavalry force crashing into the disorganized Seljuk ranks was disproportionate to its actual combat power. By late afternoon, the Seljuk withdrawal had become a rout. Kerboga attempted to rally his forces, but the sandstorm made communication impossible and the momentum of the collapse irreversible. His coalition army, which had numbered perhaps 70,000 to 80,000 warriors that morning, was disintegrating. Thousands fled the battlefield, many abandoning their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape. Others were cut down by pursuing Crusaders or trampled in the chaos of the retreat. The sandstorm began to subside as evening approached, and as visibility improved, the scale of the Seljuk disaster became apparent. The plain before Antioch was littered with bodies, abandoned weapons, tents, and supplies. The Crusaders, barely able to believe their victory, began the grim work of collecting the spoils. They found Kerboga's camp intact, filled with the food and supplies they so desperately needed. The irony was profound. They had gone into battle expecting martyrdom and found instead salvation and abundance. Aftermath and analysis. The casualties from the Battle of Antioch are difficult to determine with precision, given the tendency of medieval chroniclers to exaggerate numbers and the chaos of the battle itself. Crusader sources claim that tens of thousands of Seljuk warriors died, though these numbers are almost certainly inflated. Modern historians estimate that the Seljuk army probably lost somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 men killed or captured, with many more scattered and never rejoining Kerboga's forces. The Crusader casualties, while proportionally significant, were probably numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands, remarkable given the numerical disparity and the apparent hopelessness of their position just hours before. The strategic impact of the battle was immense. Kerboga's defeat shattered the coalition he had assembled and eliminated the immediate military threat to the Crusaders in northern Syria. No comparable Muslim force would be assembled to challenge them for months. This breathing space allowed the Crusaders to consolidate their hold on Antioch, recover their strength, and eventually continue their march toward Jerusalem, which they would capture in July 1099. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant. For the Crusaders, the victory at Antioch became proof of divine favor. How else could such a small, starving army have defeated such overwhelming numbers? The sandstorm was interpreted as a miracle, a sign that God had literally sent the winds to fight for his warriors. This conviction would sustain the Crusaders through the remaining trials of their campaign and became a foundational legend of the crusading movement. For the Muslim world, the defeat was a shocking wake-up call. The Crusaders, who had been dismissed by many as ignorant barbarians who would quickly succumb to disease, starvation, or military defeat, had now demonstrated resilience and military capability that demanded respect. The failure to crush them at Antioch, when they seemed most vulnerable, showed that these invaders would not be easily expelled. The perfect storm. Understanding the victory. How did 10,000 Crusaders defeat 80,000 Seljuk warriors? The question has fascinated military historians for centuries, and the answer lies in the convergence of multiple factors, each necessary but not sufficient on its own. First, desperation bred courage. The Crusaders fought with nothing to lose. They believed they faced death by starvation if they remained in Antioch, so death in battle held no additional terror. This created a psychological asymmetry on the battlefield. The Crusaders would accept any level of casualties to break through, while individual Seljuk contingents had much less reason to stand and die. Second, the coalition nature of Kerboga's army proved a critical weakness. Unlike the Crusaders, who despite their political divisions were united by religious ideology and the shared experience of 2 years of campaigning together, Kerboga's forces were bound together primarily by political calculation and expectations of easy victory. When those expectations proved false, the coalition fractured. Third, the terrain and deployment limited the Seljuk advantages in mobility and numbers. The Crusaders positioned themselves with protected flanks and advanced in a compact formation that was difficult to envelope or outmaneuver. The marshy ground and river prevented the kind of sweeping cavalry movements that were the hallmark of Seljuk tactics. Fourth, the religious fervor inspired by the Holy Lance cannot be discounted. Medieval warfare was as much about morale and psychology as about weapons and tactics. Soldiers who believe they fight with divine blessing will endure hardships and take risks that others will not. The Holy Lance, whatever its true provenance, provided that psychological edge. But above all, there was the Sandstorm, the single factor that transformed a likely massacre into an unexpected victory. Without it, the Seljuk cavalry would have picked apart the Crusader formation from a distance, raining arrows on them while staying out of reach of their hand weapons. The superior numbers would have allowed envelopment and encirclement. The mobility of the Seljuk forces would have negated whatever tactical discipline the Crusaders maintained. The Sandstorm neutralized every Seljuk advantage and amplified every Crusader strength. It turned a battle that should have been decided by mobility, ranged weapons, and numerical superiority into one decided by close quarters, fighting, discipline, and sheer determination. Exactly the conditions where the Crusaders were most dangerous. Was it divine intervention, as the Crusaders believed, or simply a meteorological coincidence that happened at exactly the right moment? From a historical perspective, the distinction may not matter. What matters is that natural forces intervened in human affairs with decisive effect, and that intervention was interpreted through the lens of faith in a way that shaped not just that battle, but the entire trajectory of the First Crusade. Legacy and legend. The Battle of Antioch entered Crusader legend almost immediately. It was recounted in chronicles, sung in poems, depicted in art, and became one of the defining moments of the crusading ideal. The image of outnumbered Christian warriors standing firm against overwhelming odds, sustained by faith and rewarded by divine intervention, became central to crusading propaganda and self-image. The battle also demonstrated that the Crusades, whatever else they were, represented a genuine military challenge to the Muslim powers of the Near East. The Seljuk Turks had dominated the region militarily for decades, and Kerboga was one of their most capable commanders. His defeat showed that the Crusaders, despite being far from home in unfamiliar territory, could win even against seemingly impossible odds. For military historians, the Battle of Antioch serves as a case study in how factors beyond pure military capability can determine outcomes. Morale, environmental conditions, timing, luck, and the structural integrity of military coalitions can all prove decisive. The best army on paper doesn't always win, especially when nature itself enters the equation. The battle also highlights how technological and tactical systems can be vulnerable to environmental disruption. The Seljuk military system, centered on mobile horse archers, was sophisticated and had proven effective in countless engagements. But it was optimized for specific conditions: open terrain, good visibility, and weather that allowed for precise archery. Remove those conditions, and the system's advantages disappeared. The Crusaders, with their simpler tactical approach and reliance on close-quarters combat, proved more adaptable to the changed conditions. In the end, the Battle of Antioch reminds us that history is shaped not just by human decisions and actions, but by the unpredictable intervention of natural forces. A sandstorm that blew at exactly the right time, from exactly the right direction, changed the course of the First Crusade and possibly the political future of the entire Near East. 10,000 starving warriors defeated 80,000 because nature, in its indifference or providence, tipped the scales at the decisive moment. the Crusaders marched away from Antioch with their faith strengthened and their reputation established. The road to Jerusalem still lay ahead, with many more battles to fight and hardships to endure. But they had survived what should have been their annihilation, and that memory would sustain them through the trials to come. Whether by miracle or meteorology, they had witnessed something extraordinary on the plains before Antioch. A perfect storm that turned certain defeat into legendary victory.